Senator McCormick.
Great. Senator Rubio, good to see you again. I'm looking forward to working with you closely on many of the issues we're going to discuss today. As a senator, you've been a strong voice for American leadership, and I'm really confident you'll be a strong Secretary of State on behalf of President Trump and the American people for advancing America's interest. I believe you're the right man for the job. When we met privately, we talked about a range of topics, from China to Israel to the fate of the hostages in Gaza to energy policy. We also talked about something that hits home here in Pennsylvania for my constituents, which is the fate of Mark Fogle. As you and I discussed, Mark has been imprisoned by the Russians since 2021. I've had a chance to meet with his mom, 95-year-old Mafa. She was at the Butler rally with myself and President Trump in the front row when he was shot. We need to bring him home. It took far too long for the State Department to designate Mark as wrongfully detained by the Russian government, and was really a gut punch to many of us in Pennsylvania that Mark wasn't included in the swap last year. So, Senator, will you commit to working with me and others in our delegation to make Mark's return home a high priority?
Absolutely. And in fact, I've been involved already. I've met with those families as well. We've had conversations about this. And there are two things I'd point to. Number one, this is a ridiculous case. I mean, this is an American that clearly there was an order given at some level that if you see an American and you have anything you can charge them with, let's charge them and let's collect these because we can trade them in the future for something. There's a global market for this now. And it's one of the challenges of the 21st century. There is now an active global market for detaining Americans wrongfully in Venezuela, in Russia, in China, or somewhere else, Iran, and then using them to trade for something they want in the future. And so I think there needs to be greater awareness put out about that reality. Although people are still going to travel, and Americans are still a free people that have the ability to travel, this is a real risk. In this particular case, this has nothing to do with politics. No one can claim, nor do they, that he's a spy or that he's involved in a national security threat. And so this is a case that has to be elevated, and hopefully one that can be done through strong private diplomacy, at a minimum as a goodwill gesture. Because if they're not willing to do this, then not to mention the broader challenges posed to us by what Putin is doing in Ukraine, then I think the chances of improvement in U.S.-Russian relations are impossible. But this is not that this would solve that problem, but it is at a minimum the kind of thing you would hope to see if anyone is serious about improving relations, especially if we can get the situation in Ukraine to a peaceful standing. And I hope that this case will be one that we can reach a good result on.
Good. Thank you. On the sad topic of hostages, as you know, Dean and I, my wife, live in Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh. We've been part of a meeting with hostages in Israel and in the United States as recently as last week. Noah Aragami and Ronan and Orna Nutra, who lost their son, sadly, Omer, recently came to visit. And, President Trump said recently that all hell will be to pay if the hostages aren't released. If confirmed, what emphasis would you put on releasing those hostages in Gaza? Do you agree that a permanent ceasefire in Gaza absolutely must include the release of those hostages?
Well, it must include it, because if it doesn't, there won't be a ceasefire for long. I mean, the Israeli commitment to bringing back their civilians, that's what these are. These are civilians. These are people, these are innocent people who were targeted and have been held in horrifying conditions, the health and well-being of which many of them we still don't know, but we believe there's a substantial number that are going to be released as part of this first tranche. And that's an important point as well. In regards to this agreement that has now been publicly reported on, it's not everyone. I think there's a first tranche of women, children, and people over a certain age, and then a second tranche of releases of males that are of military age, who they claim are all combatants, even though they are not. They just happen to be of a certain age. But without the hostage situation resolved, this situation will not be resolved. It is the linchpin of what's happened now. Hamas has been severely degraded. But these people, that include a number of American citizens, need to be home as soon as possible, and that will remain a priority in any engagement that we're involved in with regards to not just a ceasefire, but some permanent peace process moving forward.
Very good. Thank you. Since October 7th, there's been a disturbing rise in anti-Semitism, pro-terrorist violence in our cities, on college campuses. You and I had the opportunity to write an op-ed together. And in that op-ed, we called on foreign nationals who support Hamas or other terrorist organizations to lose their visas and to be sent back to their home countries. As Secretary of State, of course, you'll be responsible for overseeing the issuance of visas. How will you enforce our laws to ensure that we remove supporters of terrorist groups from our country?
Listen, my view on this is one of common sense. Okay? If you apply for a visa to come into the United States, and in the process of being looked at, it comes to light that you're a supporter of Hamas, we wouldn't let you in. If we knew you were a supporter of Hamas, we would not give you a visa. So now that you got the visa and you're inside the U.S. and now we realize you're a supporter of Hamas, we should remove your visa. If you could not come in because you're a supporter of Hamas, you should not be able to stay on a visa if you're a supporter of Hamas. That's how I view it. And I think that's just an issue of common sense. And we intend to be very forceful about that.
Good. Thank you. You know, fentanyl is killing 4,000 Pennsylvanians each year, over 200 Americans a day. President Trump campaigned on this throughout the country, in Pennsylvania, as did I, on we have to stop that flow of fentanyl. And, of course, violent criminal groups in Mexico, including the Jalisco and Sinaloa cartels, terrorize our communities here at home with this deadly fentanyl, and the Mexican people with endless violence. As Secretary, will you initiate the process to designate these groups, these cartels, as foreign terrorist organizations? And if so, can you describe for the American people the national security tools that unlocks, that designation unlocks, to degrade the cartels?
Well, first of all, the designation of a designated terrorist, foreign terrorist organization brings with it a host of things. It makes it illegal to cooperate or work with them in any way or to be supportive of their endeavors. It cuts off access to all sorts of banking opportunities and the like around the world where it's important to move money around. Now, that said, it's probably an imperfect tool when it comes to these groups that you're discussing, because these are sophisticated criminal enterprises. They are terrorizing the United States, but they are sophisticated criminal enterprises, and they operate in the trafficking of people, drugs, and migrants to horrifying effect. Sadly, they also have basically operational control over huge swaths of the border regions between Mexico and the United States. That's just an unfortunate fact, and it's one we're going to have to confront with our partners in Mexico, is that these sophisticated transnational terroristic organizations have operational and functional control over huge swaths of areas that border the United States of America. And so whether that is the tool that we use, which is maybe the appropriate one, or some new one that we come up with, it is important for us not just to go after these groups, but to identify them and call them for what they are, and that is terroristic in their nature, because they are terrorizing America with mass migration and with a flow of drugs.
What about military force?
Well, that's an option the president has at his disposal. Obviously, it's not one that is in the purview of the Department of State. Yeah. I think President Trump is someone that never publicly discusses his options and leaves himself the flexibility to act. I think there's a lot we can and will continue to do in close partnership with our allies in Mexico. I think there's more they can do as well to confront this challenge. And my preference would be, from the Department of State's perspective, my preference would be that we can work with the Mexicans on this issue cooperatively, because it is impacting their nation as much as ours. These sophisticated groups, these criminal organizations, don't simply threaten America, they threaten the Mexican political process. In the last election, you had multiple presidential candidates and other candidates to other offices assassinated. You've had journalists targeted and assassinated for speaking out against these groups. So these groups don't simply terrorize the United States, they're terrorizing and in some ways undermining the Mexican government and Mexican sovereignty and the health and well-being of the Mexican people. And so my hope, in a perfect world, is that we could work in close collaboration with Mexican authorities to take these groups out.
Very good. Thank you. Final question. The Chinese Communist Party, as you said in your testimony, has waged a deliberate campaign of economic warfare against the United States and our allies. We need to restore, as President Trump has said, reciprocity in that economic relationship and impose cost on Beijing for hurting American workers. How can the United States counter that campaign? How do you think about the economic tools that the administration can apply to cut off the flow of American capital and technology that supports China's geopolitical ambitions?
Well, and again, much of what it comes to trade and so forth in this administration will be handled through the Department of Commerce, but we'll certainly have an economic undersecretary and a whole entire bureaus that will be dedicated to what we can contribute to that endeavor. So I'll just share my views broadly on it. Number one, I think it would make common sense to everybody that if by and large, a relationship in which their companies can do whatever they want here, but we can't do it there, is a pretty unfair relationship. And it's something we've allowed in the past for allied countries who were small, poor, and developing. That cannot continue, in my view, and I think that's the president's view. The second is there's much that needs to be done with regards here domestically. I think we once again as a nation, this is not a Department of State issue, but once again as a nation need to prioritize the importance of our industrial capacity and our access to supply chains domestically, especially in key and critical industries. Maybe not every industry, but some key industries. We should either have a domestic capacity or an allied capacity that's reliable and can't be used against us in a moment of conflict as leverage. The third point I would make is we need to be actively engaged in the world. As an example, the Chinese own significant mineral rights and mining rights in Argentina, in Chile, throughout Africa. It's one of the reasons why the polar region and the Arctic region has become so critical as well in that regard, is because they are scooping up all over the world these mineral rights, port rights, etc., that place us at an enormous disadvantage in the long term. And it's what I said in that short answer is if this trend continues, we are going to wind up living in a world where much of what we depend on for our security, our health, our safety, and our economic prosperity will largely depend on whether the Chinese allow us to have it or not. And that cannot be a world that we leave for our children.
Thank you, Senator.